6 days after my son's wedding, my brakes vanished halfway down Black Ridge Road. I survived because an empty drainage ditch caught the truck. Police blamed its age. That evening, my new daughter-in-law returned my missing spare key and said she had found it beneath a wedding table. The venue had cleared every table before I left. I appreciate you being here with me. One small thing before we start. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever trusted someone completely, only to find out they weren't who you thought? Yes or no, I'd love to know. I read more of your words than you realize. A quick note, some details in this story are fictionalized for narrative purposes. The message at its core is what truly matters. The brake pedal went to the floor and nothing happened. No resistance, no grab, no friction. Just my boot pressing dead weight into the floorboard while the truck gained speed on the downhill grade of Black Ridge Road. I am 67 years old. I have driven this stretch of gravel above the basin 1,000 times, maybe more. In every kind of weather Nye County can throw at a man. Brakes don't just vanish. They fade, they squeal, they warn you. These didn't warn me. They disappeared, like someone had reached under the chassis and cut a line. The gravel shoulder blurred past. I downshifted, hard, second gear, the transmission screaming, and hauled the wheel left toward the shallow drainage ditch that runs along the road's edge. The truck hit the culvert sideways at maybe 20 miles an hour. The seatbelt caught my ribs like a fist. Dust swallowed the windshield. Something metal buckled under the frame, and then everything went quiet. That ringing. Underwater quiet that follows a thing your body understood before your mind caught up. I sat there for a long time. Sage and creosote bled through the cracked windshield. My hands were still locked on the wheel, knuckles white, and I could taste copper on my tongue. The flavor of adrenaline burning through every vein I had left. A deputy showed up 40 minutes later. Young kid, polite, the kind who calls you sir and means it. He looked at the truck, looked at me, and delivered his verdict like he was reading a fortune cookie. "These old lines dry rot out here in the heat, Mr. Caldwell," he said. "Lucky you kept your head." "I've been driving this road 40 years, I told him. Brakes don't just vanish. "They do when the truck's got 200,000 miles on it, sir." You ever have a moment where your hands know the answer before your brain catches up? Standing on that gravel shoulder, watching the deputy clip his report to a clipboard. I felt it in my fingers, the same instinct that had kept me alive under heavy equipment for 30 years in Nevada's mining country. Something was wrong. Not old truck wrong, not dry rot wrong. Wrong the way a cut looks different from a crack. If you've spent your life reading metal, I didn't argue with the kid. I let him call the tow. I rode home in the cab with my ribs throbbing against the seatbelt bruise, and by the time I limped through my own front door, the adrenaline had burned off and left behind something colder, suspicion. The ranch was quiet. It had been quiet for 14 months now since Lorraine passed. Since the morphine finally took her voice, and then everything else. I cleaned the cut on my forearm at the kitchen sink, changed my shirt, and sat down at her old writing desk in the back room. The desk still smelled like her hand cream, chamomile, and something faintly sweet that I could never identify and she could never remember the name of. Grief has a smell. It smells like chamomile and dust and a closet full of dresses nobody will ever wear again. I reached behind the false panel in the wall and opened the fireproof safe. Inside. Beneath the deed and the insurance papers and Lorraine's wedding ring sat a manila folder I hadn't touched in 8 months. The geological survey. The extraction lease. The lithium rights to 412 acres of basin land that 3 different companies had tried to buy before Lorraine got sick, and that she made me swear on the last night she could still form words. To keep hidden. "Keep the land," she had whispered. "Let the boy earn his own way." The boy was Garrett, my son, 34. Newly married as of 6 days ago to a woman named Vivian Ashford, a woman I'd met exactly 3 times before the wedding, and who smiled at me the way people smile at furniture they planned to rearrange. $36 million. That was the last appraisal. $36 million, sitting in a folder, in a wall safe, in a ranch house at the end of a dirt road. And the only person who could have talked me out of hiding it was already in the ground. I closed the safe. I pressed the panel shut. I sat in Lorraine's chair and listened to the house settle around me, the tick of cooling metal, the wind pushing dust against the windows. The particular silence of a home that's forgotten how to hold 2 voices. Then the phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I walked over and looked at the screen. Vivian, Garrett's wife of 6 days. Her voice came through warm, concerned, almost tender. She was driving out tonight, she said, to check on me. She'd heard about the trouble on the road and wanted to make sure I was all right. I thanked her. I hung up, and I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone, trying to understand one simple thing. I hadn't told a soul about the accident, not Garrett, not the neighbors, not anyone. So how did Vivian already know? Headlights swept across the kitchen wall 20 minutes after the call, too fast, as if she'd already been on her way before she dialed. I set the phone down and watched through the window as a white SUV rolled to a stop beside the porch. The door opened, and out stepped Vivian Ashford. My son's wife of 6 days, 30 years old, former paralegal. The kind of woman who wore a pressed linen blazer to a ranch house on a Tuesday night. She made it look like the rest of us had been dressing wrong our entire lives. Her smile arrived before she did, fixed and symmetrical, and it never quite reached those pale green eyes. "Eugene," she said, stepping onto the porch with a canvas tote over one shoulder. "I came as soon as I heard. Are you all right?" She hugged me. Light, careful, the way you hug a piece of furniture you're not sure is stable. I let her in. I offered coffee from the pot I'd brewed that afternoon, and never finished. It was bitter and stale. But she didn't touch it anyway. She moved through the kitchen with quick, sweeping glances. Not the way a concerned daughter-in-law checks on an injured man. The way someone catalogs a room. The desk, the hallway, the back wall. I watched her eyes track across the surfaces like she was reading a floor plan. Then she reached into the tote and placed a key on the counter. "I found this under one of the reception tables when the venue staff were cleaning up," she said. "Figured you'd want it back before you missed it." I picked it up. My spare house key, the one I kept on a carabiner clipped to the inside pocket of my dress jacket. I turned it over in palm. Cold metal. Familiar teeth. "That's kind of you, Vivian," I said. "Didn't even know it was gone." "You should really rest. Eugene," she touched my shoulder. "Accidents like that at your age, they sneak up on you. You know the difference between someone who's worried about you and someone who's checking whether the job got done? It's in the questions they don't ask." Vivian spent 20 minutes in my kitchen that night. She asked about my ribs. She asked if I needed groceries. She asked if the truck was totaled. She never once asked how it happened. Not the road, not the speed, not what failed. She already knew. She knew the way a person knows the ending of a story they helped write. I walked her to the door at 8:45. Her perfume stayed behind, something floral and deliberate that didn't belong in a house that smelled like sage and old wood. I stood on the porch and watched her taillights until they were red pinpoints on the dirt road. And then I locked the door and pressed my back against it. The key sat on the counter where she'd placed it. I stared at it for a long time. Something was rattling in my head. Not the accident, not the brakes, something else, something smaller, a detail that wouldn't line up. I brushed my teeth. I changed into the old flannel I sleep in. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and let my mind do what it does when I stop trying to force it to wander backward. One bolt at a time. Tightening things that felt loose. Memory is a strange mechanic. It doesn't fix things in order. It finds the one bolt that's been rattling loudest and goes there first. The wedding reception. The last hour. I was the final guest to leave. I always am. because Lorraine used to say that leaving early was just bragging about having somewhere better to be. I remembered standing by the side door while the venue coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard and a ponytail, sealed the lost and found bin with packing tape. I held the door for her while she carried it out to her car. Every unclaimed item, every jacket, every phone charger, every earring was inside that bin before the last table was wiped down. No key could have been found under a table after that bin was sealed. It was impossible. Vivian had my spare key before the reception ended, maybe before the wedding started. I sat up. I turned on the desk lamp. I pulled the notepad from the drawer, the one Lorraine used for grocery lists. The paper still faintly lined with her pencil marks, and I pressed the pen hard into the page. Someone is lying to me, and maybe tried to kill me. 8 words, steady as a blueprint. I set the pen down and looked at the notepad, then at the kitchen doorway where the key still sat on the counter. It didn't feel like something returned. It felt like something planted. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, the notepad was still on the bedside table, those 8 words staring up at me like an accusation I'd written against myself for not seeing it sooner. I poured coffee I didn't taste and picked up the phone before the pot was done, because some questions rot if you let them sit overnight. The venue coordinator answered on the 3rd ring. Young voice, professional, the kind of person who keeps records because records are her religion. I told her I was calling about the reception, my son's wedding, 6 days ago, and asked about the lost and found process. "We log everything, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Once the bin's sealed, nothing goes in or out. That's liability protocol." "And no one contacted you afterward about a key?" "No, sir. No calls, no emails. Your event was clean." I thanked her and hung up. I stood at the kitchen counter with the phone in one hand and the spare key in the other, the one Vivian had placed right there on that exact spot of Formica, with her manicured fingers and her story about finding it under a table. The coordinator had sealed that bin before the last table was wiped. I was there. I watched her do it. A lie told with a smile is still a lie, and this one had been delivered gift-wrapped on my own front porch by a woman I'd known for less than a year. I put the key in my pocket. I called the tow company, and then I called Murray. Murray Dalton was 69 years old and ran a heavy equipment repair shop on Route 160 outside Pahrump. He'd rebuilt my first dozer transmission in 1986, stood beside me at Lorraine's funeral, and had never once in 4 decades told me something he didn't mean. If there was a man in Nye County who could read a brake line the way a doctor reads an X-ray, it was Murray. The tow driver dropped the truck at the shop around 2 in the afternoon. I drove out in Lorraine's old Buick, the one that still smelled like her. Lavender sachets in the glove box, and found Murray already circling the Ford with his arms crossed. Reading the undercarriage the way he reads everything, slowly, silently, with his jaw set. "Just want to know what happened down there," I told him, for my own head. Murray looked at me. He had a face like weathered sandstone cracks in all the right places. Nothing decorative, everything structural. He wiped his hands on a rag that was already black and squinted at the truck like it owed him money. "You drove this truck 30 years and never once asked me to second-guess a brake job," he said. "So what aren't you telling me?" There are friends who ask what's wrong, and friends who already know, they just wait for you to say it out loud. Murray was the second kind. He'd seen my face when I walked in. He'd clocked the way I kept my hand in my pocket, turning that key over and over between my fingers like a rosary bead. He knew something was off. He just wasn't going to insult me by guessing. "Check the lines first," I said. "Then I'll tell you whatever you want to hear." He nodded once. No argument. No follow-up. He pulled the creeper from against the wall, lay down on it with a grunt that said more about his knees than his willingness, and rolled himself under the truck. I stood in the shop and waited. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air tasted like diesel and WD-40 and hot metal, the flavor of every honest day's work I'd ever done. A radio in the back played something country and low. I listened to Murray's tools, the click of a flashlight, the tap of a wrench handle against a bracket, the scrape of a fingernail on metal. Small sounds, precise sounds. The vocabulary of a man who'd spent 50 years listening to machines tell him what hurt. 5 minutes. 10. The sounds stopped. Murray didn't move. I heard the creeper shift once. Then nothing. The radio played, the fluorescent tubes hummed. The silence underneath the truck grew heavier than the truck itself. Then the creeper rolled out. Murray sat up on the garage floor with an oil rag in one hand and didn't say a word. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 40 years of friendship. Not confusion, not sympathy, not the gruff concern he wore when things went sideways, something flatter. Something that had already done the math and didn't like the answer. "You need to come look at this," he said quietly. And I knew, before I knelt down, before I saw anything, that the answer under that truck was going to change every question I'd been asking. I got down on my knees on that oil-stained concrete, and Murray held the shop light steady beneath the chassis, the way a surgeon holds a lamp over a wound he already knows is fatal. "There," he said, angling the beam. "Right side, rear. Follow the line from the master cylinder back." I followed it. The brake line ran along the underside of the frame rail, clipped in place every 18 inches the way Ford intended. It looked fine for the first 4 feet old. Surface grime, a little road salt from that one winter I drove to Reno. Normal. And then it wasn't. The cut was clean. Not frayed, not cracked, not corroded. A single smooth incision, precise and deliberate, cutting most of the way through the line and leaving just enough metal to hold for now. Under the shop light, the exposed edge gleamed bright and new against the dull gray of weathered tubing. "This isn't a hacksaw," Murray said, his voice flat as a spirit level. "This isn't a knife. This is a tube cutter, clean, controlled, one rotation. Whoever did this wanted the line to hold just long enough for you to get up to speed." He guided my finger to the edge. I felt it smooth as a machine's surface. No burr, no tear. The kind of cut that takes 10 seconds with the right tool and a steady hand. The hydraulic fluid had wept out slowly, pooling in a dark stain on the concrete beneath the truck. It smelled sharp and mineral, like something pulled from deep underground. Let me tell you something about brake lines. They don't just quit on you. Not like that. Not clean like that. A line that fails from age cracks at the fittings, or it corrodes from the outside in, leaving green and white residue you can see from 3 feet away. This line was cut in the one spot where a driver would never look during a walk-around, tucked behind the axle, shielded by the heat shield. Invisible unless you were lying on your back with a light. Murray rolled out and sat on the creeper with his forearms on his knees. The fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead. The country station in the back had gone to a commercial, and the shop was so quiet I could hear the tick of the cooling engine. "I've rebuilt transmissions for you since Reagan was in office," he said. "This truck didn't fail. Somebody made it fail." I didn't answer right away. I was staring at the cut, trying to make it mean something other than what it meant. But metal doesn't lie. Metal is the most honest thing on earth. It bends, it breaks, it corrodes, and it tells you exactly how and why if you know how to listen. And this metal was telling me that someone had knelt in the same position I was kneeling now, reached up with a tube cutter, and decided that I should die on a downhill grade. "Whoever did this didn't want it to fail on the flat," Murray continued. "They wanted it to fail on a hill when it mattered most. Whoever did this chose where you'd die, not just how." There's a silence that comes after a mechanic tells you someone tried to kill you. It doesn't sound like quiet. It sounds like the world rearranging itself into a shape you don't recognize. Same walls, same lights, same man you've trusted for 40 years. But everything tilted 5 degrees to the left, and nothing quite fits where it used to. Murray waited, He was good at waiting. "So I need you to answer me straight," he said. "Who has had access to this vehicle in the last 2 weeks?" I opened my mouth to say I didn't know. But that would have been a lie, and Murray had just shown me what lies look like when they're cut into metal. The truth was simpler and worse. 2 days before the wedding, someone had borrowed the truck, needed it for an errand, they said, picking up table linens from a rental place here in Pahrump. I'd handed over the keys without thinking, the way you hand things to family because family doesn't need a reason. The truck came back that evening with the driver's seat pushed forward 3 inches and the mirrors tilted at angles that didn't match my height. I'd adjusted them without a thought. Who wouldn't? You don't interrogate a mirror. I stood up slowly from the concrete. My knees ached. My chest was tight. Murray was watching me with those sandstone eyes, and I could see he already knew the answer. He just needed me to say it. "One person," I said. "Garrett's wife." Murray didn't blink. He just folded the oil rag once, set it on the creeper, and said, "Then you've got a problem that doesn't fit in this shop." I drove home from Murray's shop with both hands on the wheel, and my jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. Murray had told me the problem didn't fit in his shop. He was right. It didn't fit anywhere. Not in a shop, not in a family, not in any version of the world I'd been living in a week ago. But I wasn't going to the police. Not yet. A cut brake line proves someone sabotaged a truck. It doesn't prove who gave the order. And the law needs more than a photograph of a key and a dead man's instinct. I needed proof that would hold up in a room full of strangers, so I started with the photographs. The wedding photographer was a young man out of Tonopah who ran a one-man studio above a feed store. I called him the next morning, told him I wanted the full, unedited set for a family album. He put everything on a thumb drive, 347 frames, and I picked it up before lunch. Back at the ranch, I loaded them onto the old desktop in Lorraine's study, printed every one on glossy 4x6 paper, and fanned them across her walnut writing desk in chronological order. 347 photographs. Vivian appeared in maybe 60 of them. The key had to be in one. I started at the beginning of the ceremony, the vows, the receiving line, and worked forward frame by frame. I used the magnifying glass Lorraine kept in the desk drawer for reading seed catalogs, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets she tucked into every corner of the house. I held it over each print and scanned hands, pockets, table edges, purse clasps. Searching 300 photographs for one detail is like panning for gold in a riverbed. You move 1,000 worthless grains for the one flake that changes everything. By midnight, I'd finished the first pass and found nothing. I refilled my coffee. It was cold before I remembered to drink it and started again. Second pass. Slower this time. I wasn't looking at faces anymore. I was looking at hands. Frame 214. The valet stand near the venue's side entrance, time-stamped 7:47 p.m. Vivian was mid-stride, walking toward the parking area with her clutch under one arm and a champagne flute in her right hand. Her left hand hung at her side, fingers loosely curled. And between her index and middle finger, catching the overhead light just enough to gleam, was a brass key with a red rubber cap. My spare key, my house key. The one she would claim. 4 days later, to have found under a reception table. I sat there with a magnifying glass hovering over that 4x6 print and felt the temperature in the room drop. Felt the house go cold around me. The venue coordinator had sealed the lost and found bin at 8:15 p.m. I watched her do it. Vivian had my key in her hand 28 minutes before it could have possibly been found. 28 minutes. That's the distance between a lie and a photograph. That's how far apart the story she told me on my porch and the truth she carried in her fingers actually were. I set the magnifying glass down. I stared at the print for a long time at her stride, at her face in profile, at the easy confidence of a woman walking through a wedding with a stolen key and no fear of being caught. She hadn't even tried to hide it. That was the part that burned. She didn't think anyone would look. I could have called the sheriff. I could have driven to Garrett's apartment and held that photograph in front of his face and demanded to know what his wife was doing with my house key before the cake was cut. But both of those moves would have done the same thing. They would have told Vivian I knew. And I wasn't ready for her to know I knew. Not yet. Not until I understood why. A cut brake line and a stolen key, those tell you someone wanted you dead and had access to your home. They don't tell you the reason. And without the reason, all you have is an accusation that a good attorney dismantles before lunch. So I made a different decision. I slid the photograph into a manila envelope, sealed it, and wrote the date on the front in block letters. Then I opened the false panel and placed the envelope inside the fireproof safe right next to the folder that held the lithium rights. The secret Vivian didn't know existed. 2 secrets now, locked in the same dark box. I closed the safe, I pressed the panel flat, and I sat in Lorraine's chair and said it quietly. To no one. To myself. To the woman in the photograph who thought she was smarter than a retired mechanic from Nye County. Now I know what game to play with you. Playing the long game meant I needed someone who understood the board. 2 secrets in a wall safe and a retired mechanic's gut instinct wouldn't be enough, not against someone who planned a murder around a road gradient. I needed a lawyer. And there was only one I trusted. Faye Langley's number was still in my phone under Lorraine's contact folder filed as Lorraine Legal because I had never been able to move it. Faye was 64, a semi-retired mineral rights attorney who had handled every lease and survey on our land for 15 years. She wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck and had a voice like a woman who'd spent decades telling mining executives things they didn't want to hear. Lorraine trusted her completely. That was enough for me. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Eugene Caldwell," she said, and I could hear the surprise held in check. "It's been a while." "It has," I said, "and I'm sorry it's not a social call." I told her everything, start to finish, in order. The way you lay out parts on a workbench, the brake failure on Black Ridge, the deputy's dismissal, the cut line Murray found, the tube cutter's clean edge. I told her about Vivian's visit and the key she returned, with a story that collapsed under a single phone call to the venue. I told her about the photograph, the timestamp, the red rubber cap, the 28 minutes that turned a daughter-in-law's kindness into evidence. If you've ever had to tell someone the worst thing that's happened to you and have them believe every word without question, you know what that kind of trust feels like. Faye didn't interrupt. Not once. I could hear her pen scratching through the receiver, slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of a woman building a case before I'd finished telling the story. When I stopped talking, the line went quiet for nearly 10 seconds. Then she asked one question. "Does your son know about the lithium rights?" "Eugene, does anyone—" "No," I said. Lorraine and I agreed, nobody until Garrett proved he could stand on his own. Another silence. Longer this time. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter and stared out the screen door at the sage flats going gold in the morning light. The coffee I'd brewed to steady myself had gone cold in the mug, bitter and untouched. "Then we have a problem that's bigger than a brake line," Faye said. "If your daughter-in-law tried to kill you 6 days after marrying your son, she's not acting on impulse. She's executing a plan. And plans like that have money behind them, or the promise of it. You think she knows about the mineral rights? I think someone does. And I think someone decided you were standing between them and a payout they've already spent in their heads. Playing weak when you're strong is the hardest kind of acting there is. Every muscle in your body wants to stand up and fight. To drive to your son's apartment and put the photograph on his kitchen table and demand to know what his wife is doing with a stolen key and a sabotaged truck. But Faye understood something I was still learning the moment Vivian knows I know. She changes the game. And right now, the only advantage I have is that she thinks the brakes simply failed. People who try to kill once will try again if they think they failed for the wrong reasons, Faye said. Right now, they believe the brakes just didn't do the job. That's your only advantage. They don't know you know. So what do I do? Don't confront her. Don't tip your hand. Play the grateful father who's just happy to be alive. Invite them for dinner. Thank her for checking on you. Let her believe she's smarter than you. She paused. Give me time to find out how deep this goes. How much time? As much as you can stand. I closed my eyes. The screen door creaked in the wind. Somewhere out on the flats, a truck downshifted on the highway. The sound of an engine working against gravity. The same sound my truck made on Black Ridge before the pedal went to the floor. I can stand a lot, I said. I know you can, Faye said. And then just before she hung up, she added something that landed differently from everything else in the conversation. Eugene, the name Harlan Prescott, does it mean anything to you? I told her it didn't. It will, she said. Give me 48 hours. The line went dead. I set the phone on the counter, picked up the cold coffee and poured it down the sink. Then I stood at the kitchen window and practiced the only expression I'd be wearing for the foreseeable future. The face of a grateful, diminished old man who didn't know a thing. Faye needed 48 hours. That gave me 2 days to learn the hardest skill I'd ever attempted, how to look like a man who didn't know someone was trying to kill him. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and practiced looking old. Not just 67 old, but the kind of old that makes people talk slower when they speak to you. The kind that makes a daughter-in-law pat your arm and say things like, "At your age," without flinching. I practiced the confused blink, the over-grateful nod, the way I'd let a sentence trail off midway, as though the thought had wandered out of reach. The strange thing was how natural it felt. I'd been playing some version of this man for years. Quiet, so Garrett could be loud. Small, so he could feel tall. Step aside so my son could believe he'd earned the ground he stood on. The only difference now was that I knew I was doing it. Lorraine would have hated every second of this. She always said I gave that boy too much room and not enough wall. By day 6, I was ready. I called Garrett and invited them for dinner. Roast chicken. Lorraine's recipe, rosemary, lemon. The cast iron pan she seasoned for 20 years. I hadn't cooked it since she died. The smell filled the house like a ghost walking through every room, touching everything she used to touch. Sitting across the table from someone who'd tried to end my life and passing them the salt, that's what dinner felt like. Vivian and Garrett arrived at 7. She walked in first, the way she always did. Heels on the hardwood, perfume cutting through the rosemary. A bottle of wine in one hand, and that smile in place like it had been installed at the factory. Garrett came in behind her, my son. 34 years old, a project development specialist at Lodestar Mineral Partners, with his mother's dark eyes and a handshake that never quite committed. He'd been a gentle kid, the kind who carried spiders outside instead of stepping on them, and watching him grow into a man who couldn't meet my eyes across a dinner table was a particular kind of grief that no one warns you about. I played my part. I thanked them for coming. I thanked Vivian for checking on me after the accident. I served the chicken on Lorraine's old china and let my hands tremble just slightly when I passed the platter. Not enough to alarm, just enough to remind them I was old and shaken and grateful for company. "We've been so worried about you, Eugene," Vivian said, refilling my water glass before I'd asked. Living out here all alone after something like that, it keeps me up at night. "I'm just grateful I've got family who checks in," I said. "Not everyone has that." She touched my arm. I let her, under the table. My other hand gripped my knee so hard the knuckles went white. The chicken tasted like memory, every bite pulling me back to a kitchen that had 2 voices in it. To a woman who would have seen through Vivian in 30 seconds flat. I barely sipped the wine. I needed every edge sharp, every sense tuned to the two people sitting at my table under the candlelight. The hardest part wasn't pretending to be grateful. It was realizing how much of the gratitude was still real because some part of me still wanted my son to be the man I raised him to be. Still wanted this dinner to be what it looked like instead of what it was. But the evening gave me more than it cost me. Because while Vivian was relaxed leaning back in her chair, crossing her ankles, performing comfort the way she performed everything, Garrett was falling apart in small, quiet ways that only a father would notice. His hand shook when he poured the wine. Not much, just a tremor at the wrist, the kind you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. He ate with his eyes down. He answered questions in fragments, and when Vivian mentioned the accident casually, the way you mention weather, Garrett flinched. A small involuntary contraction of the shoulders. Gone in half a second, but I saw it. My son knew something. Maybe not everything, maybe not the brake line, not the tool, not the plan, but something. And he was carrying it the way a man carries a stone in his chest, silent, heavy, and getting heavier by the hour. As Vivian cleared the dishes, Garrett looked up from his wine glass. His eyes met mine across the table, and for half a second something raw passed between us. Not guilt exactly, not a warning, but something that lived in the narrow space between what a son knows and what he can't bring himself to say. Then we both looked away, and the moment sealed itself shut like a door neither of us was ready to open. That look across the dinner table stayed with me through the night and into the next morning. My son's eyes holding something he couldn't say, and I couldn't unhear. But I didn't have time to decode Garrett. Faye's 48 hours were up. Her office sat above a title company on the main drag in Tonopah, a narrow room with law books on every wall and a window that hadn't been opened since the Clinton administration. When I walked in, she'd cleared half her desk and covered the other half with printouts. The look on her face told me the research had not gone well. "Sit down," she said. No greeting, no small talk. She pushed a glass of water toward me and opened a manila folder. "Colton, Riddle and Marsh," she began. "Las Vegas firm. They specialize in mineral rights acquisitions, mostly lithium and rare earth deposits in rural Nevada. Your daughter-in-law spent 3 years there as a paralegal." She turned a printout toward me. Firm letterhead, a staff directory page dated 3 years back. Vinian Ashford's name sat in a column of paralegals, third from the top. She didn't just answer phones, Eugene. She drafted land transfer documents, mineral lease assignments, power of attorney templates, right of first refusal agreements. She spent 3 years learning exactly how to identify, value, and acquire mineral-rich properties from people who didn't know what they were sitting on. I stared at the letterhead. The water Faye poured sat untouched. My mouth was dry anyway. "She left the firm 8 months before she met your son," Faye continued. "That's not a coincidence. That's a cooling-off period so nobody connects the dots. She waits long enough for the professional association to go stale. Then she shows up in Garrett's life like it's chance. How long does it take to plan a marriage around a murder? 8 months, apparently. If you're patient enough and the target is lonely enough." I sat in Faye's client chair and felt the armrest creak under my fingers. Everything I thought I understood about the last year, Vivian's sudden appearance in Garrett's life, her charm, her interest in the ranch, her solicitous visits, all of it rearranged itself into a shape I should have recognized, didn't. Because a father's hope is the most effective blindfold ever designed. "She targeted him," I said. "She targeted you," Faye corrected. "Garrett was the entry point. You were the objective." Faye laid out the architecture of it, how a woman with Vivian's training would have run a title search on the Caldwell property, seen the geological survey on file with the county, estimated the extraction value, and then worked backward to find the softest way in. A single father in his 30s, working in the minerals industry himself, with an aging parent on a remote ranch. Garrett wasn't just convenient. He was designed into the approach. The worst part wasn't learning what Vivian was. It was wondering whether my son ever had a chance, or whether she'd chosen him the way a locksmith chooses a key. Not for what it is, but for what it opens. "There's one more thing," Faye said. She pulled a second folder from beneath the first. "The firm's client list. I got a partial through a contact at the state bar. Not everything, but enough. One name kept showing up in connection with rural land transactions across Nye County." "Harlan Prescott," I said. Faye looked at me over her reading glasses. "You remember the name?" "You told me to." "Good, because Prescott isn't just a name. He's a licensed mineral broker who's been operating in this county for 6 years. He identifies properties, runs appraisals, and brokers extraction rights for investors. And his name appears on every Colton, Riddle and Marsh deal I could find in the county records." She paused, letting it settle. The AC unit hummed, paper rustled in the draft from the vent. "Vivian and Prescott aren't separate actors, Eugene. They're part of the same network. She finds the target, he handles the transaction. The firm provides the legal cover. It's a machine." "She was trained for this," I said, and the words tasted like something burned. "Yes," Faye said, "she was." Then she slid one more printout across the desk. It was different from the others. Not a firm document, not a client list. A county death certificate dated 2 years back. A man named Clyde Barker, 74, killed in a single-vehicle rollover on a rural highway 12 miles from my ranch. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Cast status closed. I read it twice. The glass of water sat untouched. The room felt smaller. "His land had lithium too," Faye said quietly, "and Harlan Prescott appraised it 6 weeks before he died." I set the certificate down on the desk very carefully, as if it might break. This wasn't an attempted murder. This was a pattern. A pattern of murders changes the weight of everything. One attempt on your life is personal. 2 deaths on the same kind of road, with the same broker's name in the file. That's an industry. And I was standing inside it. I knew Clyde Barker. Not well, but well enough to have waved at him across the feed store parking lot for 20 years. Well enough to have gone to the funeral and thought the casket looked too small for such a big man. He ran cattle on a spread 12 miles south of my ranch hardland. Thin grass, the kind of property that only makes sense if you love it more than money. His wife, Opal, still lived out there. I'd seen her at the post office in January, moving slower than she used to, carrying envelopes addressed in her own handwriting because there was nobody left to write to her. Faye had pulled the full county file overnight. She spread it across her desk the way Murray had spread tools under my truck, methodically grim, building toward a diagnosis neither of us wanted to hear. The accident report was 2 pages. Clyde's truck had left a straight stretch of highway on a clear afternoon and rolled into a drainage culvert. No skid marks. No mechanical inspection ordered. The deputy on scene, different kid. Same conclusion, wrote driver error, possible fatigue, and closed it in 72 hours. I'd driven past Clyde's empty house 100 times since his funeral. Past the dark windows and the fence posts leaning in the wind. And never once wondered what really happened. Never once thought to ask why a man who'd driven that road for 40 years suddenly forgot how to steer. No skid marks on a straight road. That detail sat in the report like a splinter nobody bothered to pull. "Now look at this," Faye said, sliding the land transfer records beside the accident file. She'd drawn a timeline on legal paper, a horizontal line with dates marked in her sharp handwriting. Prescott appraised the mineral rights on Barker's land. 6 weeks later, Clyde's truck rolled on that straight road. 4 months after the funeral, a company called Ridgeline Basin LLC purchased the extraction rights from Opal for a fraction of their value. "Opal," I said. "She wouldn't have known what the land was worth." No, she wouldn't have, and nobody told her. Faye tapped the Ridgeline Basin name with her pen. "This is the company that bought Barker's mineral rights. I ran the incorporation records. Edgeline Basin LLC was formed in Las Vegas, represented by legal counsel at the time of the purchase. She paused. The counsel of record was Colton, Riddle and Marsh. The same firm. The same firm where Vivian had spent 3 years drafting land transfer documents. The circle didn't just close, it locked shut, with a sound I could almost hear, like the click of a safe in reverse. I sat back in the chair. The coroner's report was still under my fingers, the paper brittle at the edges, the type fading. Clyde Barker, 74, blunt force trauma. Case closed. A man reduced to 2 pages and a shell company's line item. Faye was watching me. She'd stopped talking. The way she does when she wants you to arrive at something on your own. Prescott finds the land, I said slowly. Vivian or someone like her finds the way in. The firm handles the paperwork, and if the owner doesn't cooperate, the owner has an accident, Faye finished. And nobody inspects the vehicle. Nobody inspects the vehicle. The AC unit shuddered. I could hear traffic on the street below, ordinary sounds. Ordinary people driving ordinary roads without wondering whether someone had crawled underneath their car the night before. I leaned my forehead against the window glass. It was cold. Despite the Tonopah heat pressing against the other side, I almost became the second one, I said. Faye didn't argue. She didn't offer comfort. She opened her desk drawer, pulled out a small digital voice recorder, and set it on the desk between us. Then let's make sure there's never a third, she said. I picked up the recorder. It was smaller than I expected, silver, no bigger than a cigarette lighter, with a single red button on the side. I turned it over in my palm. You're going to need this at the ranch, Faye said. Every conversation, every visit. If Vivian comes back, and she will come back, I want her voice on tape saying things she thinks only you can hear. And if she doesn't say anything useful, Faye looked at me over her reading glasses. She will. People who think they're smarter than you always talk too much. It's the one weakness they never learn to fix. I put the recorder in my jacket pocket and stood up. The bile I'd been swallowing since I saw Clyde's death certificate finally settled into something harder, something that tasted less like fear and more like purpose. I drove home from Faye's office with the recorder in my jacket pocket and a list in my head that no sane man should ever have to make where to hide microphones in his own house so he can catch his own family lying to him. Back at the ranch, I laid 4 small digital recorders on the kitchen table, the way a man lays out tools before a job. Because that's exactly what this was now. A job with no room for error. I tested battery life on each one, ran sample recordings, played them back through the tiny speaker, and adjusted until the playback was clean. Then I placed them. One behind the bookshelf in the living room, taped flat against the wood where the shadow hid the edge. One in the glove box of the loaner truck the tow company had left me. One in the breast pocket of my work jacket. The canvas coat I wore every day, the one Vivian would expect to see hanging on the hook by the door. I stood in the kitchen and looked at my house. Same countertop, same curtains Lorraine sewed from fabric she bought in Reno. Same photographs on the wall of a family that used to make sense. But the house was different now. I had turned it into a machine, a listening device dressed up as a home. Every warm corner hiding something cold and deliberate. Wiring your own house to catch your own family is the loneliest kind of carpentry. You're building a wall out of evidence instead of wood, and you know exactly who it's meant to keep out. I thought about Lorraine, what she'd say if she walked through the door and found recorders taped behind her books. She'd have called it paranoid. But Lorraine was never someone's target. I made iced tea. I sat on the porch. The sun was going down over the basin, painting the sage flats in shades of copper and rust, and I was halfway through my glass when I heard tires on the ranch road. Garrett's silver truck. Alone. No white SUV trailing behind him. No Vivian in the passenger seat. Just my son, pulling up to the house the way he used to when he was a teenager, coming home late, slow, tentative, like the truck itself was deciding whether to stop. He got out and walked to the porch. He was wearing a polo shirt I'd never seen and an aftershave I didn't recognize. New things, post-wedding things, pieces of a life that had been assembled by someone else's hands. He sat down on the top step, 3 feet from my chair, and didn't look at me. "Dad, I just wanted to check that you're—" He stopped, started again. "I mean, after the accident, are you really—" "I'm fine, son," I said. I poured the second glass of iced tea I'd made without thinking the habit of a father who always prepares for 2, even when he eats alone. I set it on the step beside him. "What is it you're trying to say?" He picked up the glass. He didn't drink from it. He turned it in his hands the way he used to turn a baseball when he was a boy, working up the nerve to ask me something he thought I'd say no to. There's a sound. A father learns to recognize the sound of his child trying to be brave and failing. I hadn't heard it from Garrett since he was 9 years old and afraid of the dark. He used to stand in the hallway outside our bedroom door, breathing fast, not knocking, waiting for me to hear him without having to ask. I always did. I heard him now. "Garrett," I said quietly, "whatever it is, you can say it." He opened his mouth. I saw the words gather behind his eyes, something heavy, something that had been pressing on him since the dinner, maybe longer, maybe since the wedding itself. His jaw tightened. His hands went still on the glass. Then he stood up. The iced tea sloshed but didn't spill. He set it on the rail, untouched. "Nothing," he said. "It's nothing. I gotta go. I'm sorry. Dad, I'm sorry." He was down the steps and at his truck before I could stand. The door slammed. The engine caught. Gravel sprayed from under the tires, and he was gone down the dirt road past the fence line into the desert dark. I stood at the porch rail with both hands gripping the wood and watched his taillights shrink to red pinpricks and then to nothing. The dust settled. The sage went quiet. The iced tea sat on the rail where he'd left it, the glass still cold, still full. He'd said, "I'm sorry," not "I'm worried," or "take care of yourself," or "call me if you need anything." Sorry. A word that only means something if there's a reason behind it, and Garrett had left before the reason could follow him out of his mouth. Garrett's apology kept me up most of the night. Sorry. A word that weighs nothing when it's polite and everything when it isn't. But I didn't have the luxury of decoding my son's guilt. Vivian was already on her way. The white SUV came up the drive at 10 sharp, and she stepped out carrying a leather folder the way a process server carries a summons with purpose and no apology. Cream blouse, dark slacks, dressed for business disguised as a family visit. I met her at the door in my work jacket, with the recorder running in the breast pocket. "I brought something for you to look at," she said, setting the folder on the kitchen table before I'd finished pouring coffee. "After what happened on the road, Garrett and I talked, and we think it's important to have some legal protections in place." She opened the folder and slid out an 8-page document with a notary block on the last page. Emergency Health Care Power of Attorney. She placed a pen beside it. "It's just a precaution, Eugene. We'd never forgive ourselves if something else happened, and nobody had the authority to make decisions for you." I picked up the first page, held it at arm's length, and squinted the confused old man. Bad eyes, grateful heart. She started walking me through it, and that's when her training showed through the costume. She didn't summarize the way a worried family member would. She navigated. Her manicured finger tapped clause numbers. Section 3 covers hospitalization authority. Section 5 addresses financial obligations during incapacity, explaining fiduciary language with the ease of someone who drafted documents like this professionally. No hesitation, no fumbling. She knew this paper the way Murray knew an engine. Someone handing you a document with a smile and a pen, telling you it's for your own good, while the fine print says they own everything you've got. That's what sitting at my kitchen table felt like. Her voice was warm. Her hand rested on my arm twice, and every word was designed to make an old man sign something he didn't understand. Except I understood every word. "That's real thoughtful," I said, rubbing my eyes. "My vision's been giving me trouble since the accident, though. Can't read the fine print so good. Give me a few days to get my eyes checked, and I'll sit right back down with this." Something moved behind her face. Not anger, she was too controlled, but a tightening at the jaw. A glance at her watch that lasted half a second. She was on a timeline, and I had just put a wrinkle in it. "Of course," she said, her smile recalibrating. "Just don't wait too long. These things are time-sensitive." I walked her to the door, thanked her again, and waved from the porch as she pulled away. The grateful father performing for an audience of one. The moment her taillights cleared the fence line, I went inside and locked the door. The recorder had captured everything. I checked the playback. Her voice came through clean. Every clause, explanation, every rehearsed phrase of concern. I saved the file. Then I sat down at Lorraine's writing desk with the document and the magnifying glass. Healthcare power of attorney, that's what she called it. Pages 1 through 3 covered hospital decisions, medication authority, end-of-life directives. Reasonable language, the kind any family might prepare after a scare. But I didn't stop at page 3. Page 4, subsection 8, paragraph 2. The type was smaller here, denser, the kind of language a non-lawyer's eyes slide over like water on glass. I held the magnifying glass steady and read it twice. Authority to manage, encumber, sell, or transfer real property and mineral interests held by the principal. Real property and mineral interests. There it was, buried under 4 pages of medical language, like a knife hidden under a napkin. This wasn't a healthcare document. It was a transfer mechanism that would give Vivian authority over every acre I owned and everything underneath it. All she needed was my signature and a notary stamp. And the lithium rights Lorraine died protecting would belong to the woman who'd tried to kill me for them. I circled the clause with a red pen. I closed the folder, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my chest, that I had bought myself days, not weeks. Her smile on the way out had told me that much. Patience was a costume she wore well, but the jaw had tightened. The watch had been checked, and somewhere behind those pale green eyes, a clock was running that I couldn't see but could almost hear. I set the pen down on the desk, right next to the magnifying glass Lorraine used for seed catalogs, and stared at the circled words until they blurred. Then I picked up the phone and called Faye. We were done gathering evidence quietly. It was time to bring in someone with a badge. The hidden clause told me everything about Vivian's timeline, and it was shorter than mine. I called Faye that night. By morning, she had a meeting with someone who carried a badge. Detective Ross Hewitt spread 5 evidence folders across Faye's conference table like a man dealing cards in a game where nobody was bluffing anymore. He was 45, Nye County Sheriff's Office. Built like a fence post and about as expressive. The kind of detective who asked the same question 3 different ways before he believed the answer. His pen clicked steadily while he listened. I walked him through it. The brake failure, Murray's diagnosis, the key and the wedding photograph, the venue coordinator's confirmation. Vivian's paralegal history at the firm that handled mineral acquisitions. The power of attorney with its buried clause. And the death certificate, Clyde Barker, straight road, no skid marks. Land in Prescott's pocket 4 months later. Hewitt turned each piece of evidence face up, studied it, set it aside. He held the POA up to the window light and read the buried language twice. When I finished, he set his pen down. "Mr. Caldwell, I was the responding officer on the Barker rollover 2 years ago." The room went still. Faye's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "I wrote that report." Hewitt continued. "And I never liked it. No skid marks, no mechanical inspection. My sergeant closed it in 72 hours because the county was short-staffed. I've thought about that case more than I should have. There's a particular kind of relief that comes with being believed by someone who carries a badge. and a particular kind of terror when that same person tells you it's not enough. "I believe you," Hewitt said. "But belief doesn't make an arrest. I need a witness, a confession, or forensic evidence that puts a specific hand on that tube cutter. Right now, I've got a dead man's file, a suspicious wife, and a brake line. A defense attorney would eat this alive." "What if we get her on tape admitting she arranged it?" Faye asked. Hewitt's pen started clicking again. "Then we're not talking about an investigation anymore. We're talking about a case." We sat with that. The AC hummed. I could taste bitter coffee dregs and feel the weight of what he meant that I'd need to go back. Wear the mask again, and draw the people who tried to kill me close enough to say something they shouldn't. How do you sit across from the woman who tried to end your life and get her to say it out loud, without her realizing you're the one holding the trap? "She'll push for the POA signature again," I said. "Maybe within the week." "Good," Hewitt said. "When she does, but don't push, let her come to you." People who think they're in control talk more than people who think they're being watched. Faye nodded. "We also need Prescott. If she's the operator, he's the broker. One of them will slip if we give them room." "Enough to investigate," Hewitt said, stacking folders. "Not enough to arrest, not yet. But I can open a file quietly and start pulling threads. The Barker case stays cold until I have something new, but this gives me reason to look." He stood and shook my hand firm. No performance. Just the grip of a man who'd waited 2 years for someone to walk through the door and confirm what he already suspected. We were packing up when Hewitt paused. He reached into his jacket and pulled out one more document, a vehicle registration printout. "This came up when I ran your daughter-in-law's name this morning," he said. "Rental car, checked out in Vivian Ashford's name 3 days before the wedding. But the return address isn't a rental lot." He tapped the paper. "It's a mechanic shop in Henderson, independent place, no chain." Faye looked at me. I looked at the address. "I'm going to visit that shop tomorrow," Hewitt said, folding the document back into his pocket. "If she rented a car to get somewhere she didn't want traced, I want to know where and what she needed done." He put on his jacket, nodded to Faye, and walked out. The door clicked shut. I sat in the quiet office staring at the empty table where 5 folders had been. Somewhere in Henderson, a mechanic shop had a record with Vivian's name on it. And somewhere between that shop and my ranch, the truth was waiting for someone patient enough to follow the road to its end. Hewitt called at 6 in the morning, before I'd finished lacing my boots. 2 words that changed the shape of everything. Mining grade. He drove out to the ranch an hour later with the forensic report in a manila envelope. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Vivian had spread the POA, and he laid out what the lab had found. The cut on the brake line was made by a heavy-duty industrial tube cutter. Not a hacksaw, not pliers. Not anything you'd find in a consumer auto shop or a ranch tool shed. This was mining industry equipment, the kind used to service hydraulic lines at extraction sites. The cut angle and torque pattern were consistent with professional use. Whoever did this had either worked in mining or had access to someone who did. I sat very still. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I couldn't taste it anyway. My mouth tasted like dust. "You can't buy a tool like that at a hardware store," Hewitt said. "Industrial supply only. Whoever cut that line either works in the field or knows someone who does." The words came out of me before I could stop them. "Garrett works at Lodestar Mineral Partners. They'd have a tool cage full of those." Hewitt didn't react. He just wrote it down. But I saw the pen pause for half a second before it moved, and that pause told me he'd already considered the possibility and was hoping I'd be the one to say it. A tube cutter leaves a clean edge, no ragged metal, no hesitation marks. And I realized the person behind this was exactly the same precise, patient, and completely without remorse. Whether Garrett had handed that tool over knowingly or whether it had been taken from his workplace without his knowledge, the result was the same. My son's professional life had been weaponized against me. The next day, Faye called me back to her office. She'd been digging through county records and commercial databases, and what she found made the forensic report feel almost gentle by comparison. She'd uncovered a formal appraisal request submitted to Harlan Prescott's brokerage, a request to value the mineral extraction potential of the Caldwell property. The request was dated October 5 months before the wedding, and the name at the top of the form was Vivian Ashford. Prescott had stalled the report for months, Faye guessed. He wanted the real number locked to himself, not shared with the woman doing his field work. She contacted Prescott in October, Faye said, standing at her whiteboard where she'd drawn a timeline in red marker. She didn't meet Garrett until December. The appraisal request came first. The relationship came second. I stared at the whiteboard. October, December, March. Each date circled, each line connecting through Vivian like spokes through a hub. She hadn't stumbled into my son's life. She hadn't fallen in love and then discovered an opportunity. She had identified the target, my land, my mineral rights, and worked backward to find the softest entry point. Garrett wasn't a husband. He was an access route. There are things a father can survive hearing: that his son is foolish, that his son is weak, that his son made choices a wiser man wouldn't have. But hearing that his son was chosen, like a tool from a shelf, selected for his shape, his proximity, his willingness to trust, is not one of them. Then she picked him, I said quietly. She picked my son the way you'd pick a lock, because he was the right shape to get her through my door. Faye didn't argue. She capped the marker and set it on the ledge. The marriage was the first move, she said. Everything after the accident, the key, the POA, those were follow-through. She was already inside the plan before she was inside your family. I sat in Faye's client chair and stared at the timeline until the dates blurred. October appraisal, December courtship, March wedding. 6 days later, the breaks. Every dot connected through one woman. And at the center of it all, my son. Not the architect, maybe not even the accomplice, but the keystone she'd built the whole arch around. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't whether Garrett knew. It was whether he'd ever been given the choice not to. Whether Vivian had walked into his life and wrapped herself around him so completely that by the time the truth started leaking through the cracks, he was already too deep to climb out. The flinch at dinner, the midnight visit, the apology with no explanation. Maybe those weren't signs of guilt. Maybe they were signs of a man drowning in someone else's current. I lay in bed and watched the ceiling fan turn in the dark and made a decision. I was done defending, done waiting for Vivian to make the next move. It was time to give her something to move towards something false, something irresistible, and watch where she ran with it. The decision to go on offense changed everything. For 2 weeks, I'd been the hunted, collecting evidence, recording conversations, playing the grateful fool. On the morning of day 16, sitting at Lorraine's desk with a blank appraisal form and a steady hand, I became hunter. Faye had provided the template, a standard county mineral valuation form, the kind any surveyor might leave behind after a site visit. I filled it in carefully, matching the format, using the right terminology. Property description: Caldwell Ranch, 412 acres, Nye County. Estimated mineral extraction value, and here I wrote the number that would do the work, $2.8 million, not the real figure, a fraction of it. Low enough to create urgency, high enough to seem plausible. I set the document on Lorraine's writing desk and placed a coffee mug on the corner, half covering the header, as though I'd been reading it over breakfast and forgotten to put it away. The kind of carelessness an old man might manage, the kind Vivian would expect from me. You want to know the difference between a trap and a lie. A lie is something you tell to hide. A trap is something you build to reveal. I wasn't hiding anything. I was building a stage and waiting for the right actor to walk onto it. She came at 3 that afternoon. Unannounced, she never called first anymore, just appeared. The way people appear when they think they own a place before the papers are signed. I met her at the door in my work jacket. I offered coffee. She accepted. I poured 2 cups and set one on the kitchen counter where she wouldn't touch it. We made small talk. She asked about my eyes, had I seen the doctor yet. I told her I had an appointment next week, which was a lie wrapped in a stall. She nodded. Patient on the surface, but ticking underneath. Then I excused myself to the bathroom. I walked down the hallway slowly, letting my boots sound heavy on the wood floor. I closed the bathroom door. I counted to 60. When I came back, Vivian was standing in the kitchen doorway, but the coffee mug on the desk had shifted 2 inches to the left, and the appraisal form was now fully visible, its header uncovered. She'd read it. I knew because her posture had changed. The relaxed lean was gone, replaced by something straighter, more alert, the posture of a woman recalculating. I settled into my chair and sipped my coffee like a man with nothing on his mind. "Some fellow from the county came out last week," I said, casual as weather. "Poked around the north parcel, said the mineral rights aren't worth what people think, 2, maybe 3 million at best. I told him I wasn't selling anyway. Setting bait for someone you once hoped to call family feels like poisoning your own well, something you'll taste for the rest of your life." I watched her face the way Murray watches a gauge, looking for the needle to move. It moved. "That's good to know. Eugene," she said carefully, "at least you won't have people bothering you about it." Her voice was even. Her hands were still. But her eyes, those pale green eyes that never quite committed to the warmth her mouth performed, flickered with something fast and sharp. Calculation. She was doing math. If the land was worth less than 3 million, every day she waited was a day the real number might surface. She needed move. She needed that POA signed before a legitimate appraiser showed up and blew her timeline apart. She left 15 minutes later, thanked me for the coffee she never drank, touched my shoulder at the door, smiled. I stood at the window and watched her SUV pull down the dirt road. And before she'd even cleared the fence line, before the dust had settled behind her tires, she had her phone to her ear, calling someone. Not Garrett. I was sure of that. Garrett would have been at work. This was someone else. Someone who needed to hear that the land value had just dropped and the window was closing. I didn't need to hear the conversation. The bait was in the water, and the line was already moving. I picked up the recorder from my jacket pocket and pressed stop. Then I sat at Lorraine's desk, moved the coffee mug back to where it had been, and looked at the fake appraisal I'd planted like a seed in poisoned ground. "That's right, sweetheart," I said to the empty room. "Run back and tell Prescott the price just dropped. Let's see how fast you move now." The house was quiet. The trap was set. And for the first time in 2 weeks, the patience felt less like endurance and more like aim. It took exactly 22 hours for the bait to work. Vivian's SUV was back in the driveway before noon the next day, and this time she brought Garrett with her like a shield. Her heels hit the kitchen floor faster than before, shorter strides. Sharper clicks. The rhythm of a woman whose schedule had just been rewritten by a phone call. Garrett trailed behind her through the door, hands in his pockets, eyes on floor. The same posture he'd had on the porch 2 nights ago, when he'd said sorry and then driven away before the word could finish landing. I had coffee ready, recorder running, the grateful old man in place behind my face. Vivian set the paperwork on the kitchen table again, the same document, same pen beside it, and launched into a speech that would have been convincing if I hadn't known every word of it was a lie. "There are people out here who prey on landowners your age, Eugene," she said, leaning forward with her hands flat on the table. "I've seen it in my professional life. They lowball you, pressure you, and before you know it, you've signed away rights worth 10 times what they offered. Let us protect you from that." Let me tell you what it sounds like when someone uses the word protect to mean take. It sounds exactly like concern. It sounds like family, It sounds like a daughter-in-law who drives 40 minutes to sit at your kitchen table and worry about your well-being. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because if I hadn't spent 2 weeks crawling under trucks and reading death certificates and staring at photographs under a magnifying glass, I would have believed her. Any father would have. I picked up the pen, held it for a moment, letting my hand hover over the signature line. Then I set it back down, slowly, the way a man does when he wants to sign, but isn't quite ready. "You're probably right," I said. "I don't know much about minerals and such. If you've got somebody you trust to come look at it, I suppose that'd be the smart thing." Vivian's eyes sharpened. The hook was set. "I've already spoken to someone," she said. "A consultant who handles these things professionally. He can come to you so you don't even have to leave the house." "That'd be real convenient," I said. Before I tell you what she said next, the detail that locks every piece of this story into place, I need to ask, are you still with me? Because from this point on, nothing unfolds the way you'd expect. Comment your prediction in one sentence. Who do you think this consultant really is? A quick note, the next part includes some details adapted for storytelling to convey the full weight of what happened. What matters is the lesson underneath. "Next week," she said. "We need this done next week. He'll come Tuesday, and we can handle everything right here at this table. Next week, Tuesday." She'd already set the date. She'd already made the call. The consultant she was bringing to my kitchen table was Harlan Prescott, the same broker who'd appraised Clyde Barker's land 6 weeks before Barker died on a straight road with no skid marks. And Vivian was delivering him to me like a gift she didn't know she was wrapping. Garrett nodded when she looked at him. The way a man nods when the alternative is a conversation he's not ready to have. He didn't speak. He didn't add anything. He just sat in my kitchen with his mother's eyes and his wife's script and performed obedience for a woman who had tried to kill his father. Watching that was the closest I came to breaking character in 25 days. "Tuesday sounds fine," I said. "I'll make sure the house is ready." Vivian smiled. She touched my arm. She thanked me for being so reasonable. And then she left, taking Garrett with her, the way she'd brought him as a prop, not a partner. I waited until their car was past the fence line. Then I picked up the phone and called Faye. "She's bringing Prescott here herself," I said. "To my kitchen table, next week, Tuesday." There was a pause on the line. I could hear Faye's breathing, steady and measured, the way it gets when she's already 3 moves ahead. "Then that's the day we end this," she said. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the table where the unsigned POA still sat, the pen beside it untouched, the coffee cups cold. Tuesday. 7 days. Prescott would walk through my front door, expecting to meet a confused old man ready to sign his land away. Instead, he'd find a man who'd spent 25 days building a case out of brake lines and photographs and lies told by people who never imagined he was listening. Tuesday was 7 days away. 7 days to turn a kitchen table into a courtroom. But Faye said we needed one more piece. A witness who could put Vivian's hand directly on the sabotage, and Hewitt said he knew where to find one. The man in the back booth of the Route 160 diner had ordered coffee 20 minutes ago and hadn't touched it. I could tell because the cream was still sitting in a perfect cloud on the surface, undisturbed, the way liquid sits when the person holding the cup has forgotten it exists. His name was Dexter Finch. 38, gaunt, with bitten-down fingernails that drummed the table edge in a rhythm that had nothing to do with music. He'd been a field agent for Prescott's mineral brokerage until 2 months ago, when he walked away from the outfit and lost 15 pounds and most of his sleep in the process. Hewitt had found him through the Henderson mechanic shop. Dexter's name was on the rental car paperwork as an authorized driver. I sat down across from him. The vinyl booth was cracked and sun-heated. The diner smelled like grease and burnt coffee and the particular sadness of a place where people come to eat alone. I ordered coffee I didn't want and waited for him to talk. He talked. "The operation works like this. Dexter said, his voice low enough that I had to lean forward to hear him over the country station playing behind the counter. Prescott identifies the property. I scouted them, drove out, walked the parcels, pulled geological data. Then a legal contact engineers access. Sometimes it's a trust document. Sometimes it's a marriage. I sat across from a man who'd helped get my neighbor killed and felt something I didn't expect. Not rage, but recognition. Because guilt looks the same on every face, and Dexter's had been wearing it for 2 years. I scouted Barker's land, he said. I wrote the report that said his lithium was worth pursuing. 6 weeks later, the man was dead. He swallowed. I didn't pull any brake line, Mr. Caldwell, but I drew the map that got him killed. And me? I asked. Dexter looked at the table. Your daughter-in-law contacted Prescott on a burner phone. I know the number because I'm the one who bought it for her. Prepaid. Cash. From a gas station in Henderson. He paused. She called in early March. She said the old man needed to have an accident before any real appraisal hit the county records. The old man needed to have an accident. Those were her words. Hearing my daughter-in-law's murder order repeated back to me in a diner booth felt like swallowing broken glass. Every syllable had an edge, and there was nowhere to spit it out. I gripped the laminate table and held still. If the owner doesn't sell, Dexter continued. Prescott keeps a mechanic on retainer. The work is clean tube cutters on brake lines, positioned to fail on grades. Same method every time. I don't know the mechanic's name. Prescott keeps that separate. But the order came from your daughter-in-law. I heard her voice on the call. The diner clattered around us. Dishes in the kitchen. A trucker paying at the register. The world doing ordinary things, while a man across from me described a murder operation the way someone might describe a supply chain inputs, process, output. Why now? I asked. Why come forward? Because Barker's face is the last thing I see before I fall asleep, Dexter said. And because Prescott doesn't leave people like me comfortable for long. I'm a loose end. I know it. He knows it. He looked me in the eyes for the first time. I'll tell everything, the DA, a judge, whoever you need. But you have to move fast. They don't wait. I reached across the table and slid a paper napkin toward him. He picked up the pen I'd placed beside it and wrote a phone number in shaking handwriting, 10 digits, the ink bleeding into the rough paper. Then he pushed it back. That's your proof, he said. The burner number. Your daughter-in-law's calls are on it. Prescott's calls are on it. It'll hold up. I folded the napkin and slipped it into my jacket pocket, next to the recorder that had been running since I sat down. The napkin felt light. The number on it weighed more than anything I'd carried in my life. Then Dexter leaned forward and said one more thing. Mr. Caldwell, there's something else. Your son called that number too, once, 3 days before the wedding. He watched my face. I don't know what he said, but he called it. I stood up. I left a 20 on the table. I walked to my truck in the parking lot and sat behind the wheel with my hands at 10 and 2, staring at the desert through the windshield. Garrett called the burner phone 3 days before he married her, and I didn't know if that made him complicit or terrified, and I wasn't sure which answer I was more afraid of. I sat in the dark for 3 hours with the napkin on the bedside table, the burner number visible under the lamp. Trying to make Garrett's single call to that phone mean something other than what it might mean. Then the phone rang at midnight, and his name lit up the screen. I answered. Dad. His voice was raw, stripped of everything polished, everything Vivian had taught him to wear. I need you to listen to me. I can't explain everything right now, but things aren't what they look like. Vivian, she's... He stopped. I heard him breathe. I don't think she's who I thought she was. The room was dark. The phone was warm against my ear. Outside. The desert was doing what it always does at midnight. Holding still, holding quiet. As if the whole basin were waiting for someone to finish a sentence. What are you trying to tell me, son? Silence. Then his voice cracked, and what came through was the sound of a man trying to be brave and failing. The same sound I'd heard on the porch. The same sound from when he was 9 and stood in the hallway, afraid of the dark. "Just be careful," he said. "Please, I'm sorry I have to go." The line went dead. A son calling his father at midnight to say, "Be careful," without explaining why, is either the bravest thing a coward can do or the most cowardly thing a brave man can do. Manage. I sat in the dark and replayed his words against everything Dexter had told me that afternoon. Garrett called the burner phone 3 days before the wedding. But now, hearing his voice break, hearing the fear underneath the apology, I wondered if that call hadn't been conspiracy at all. Maybe he'd found something that frightened him. Maybe he called the number not to conspire, but to confirm. And when the voice on the other end confirmed what he feared, he froze. I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the covers and watched the ceiling fan turn and turn Garrett's words the same way around and around, never landing. By morning, I had nothing resolved about my son, but I had everything resolved about Tuesday. Vivian arrived at 10 with the finalized documents, alone this time, no Garrett, no shield. Her heels were brisk on the kitchen floor, her posture tighter than I'd ever seen it. She laid the documents on the table with a pen beside it and delivered her final performance. "The consultant will be here Tuesday at 10, she said. "All you need to do is sign where I've marked, and we'll handle the rest. This protects you. Eugene." Agreeing to walk into your own ambush and smile while you do it because you know you're the one who built it, that's what Tuesday morning was going to be. And Vivian was handing me the invitation. "Should I put coffee on?" I asked, letting my voice drift toward grateful. "I like to be hospitable when folks come to the house." She smiled. The smile that never reached her eyes, but had stopped bothering to try. That would be perfect, just like always. I walked her to the door. I thanked her. I waved from the porch, and the moment her SUV disappeared down the road, I went inside and picked up the phone. The first call was to Faye. "Tuesday at 10, I said. "She's bringing Prescott to the ranch herself." "I'll have everything ready," Faye said. The second call was to Hewitt. "Tuesday, 10 a.m. Prescott walks through my front door. Bring Boyd Stanton. Bring everyone. And be here by 8. Hewitt paused for 1 second. "We'll be there." I hung up. The kitchen was quiet. The POA sat on the table where Vivian had left it, the pen beside it, the signature line empty. I stared at it for a long moment. This piece of paper that was supposed to be the final lock on a trap built for me, now the centerpiece of a trap I'd built for her. Then I walked to the bedroom closet. I pushed aside the work jackets and the flannel shirts and reached into the back, where the garment bag hung heavy on its wooden hanger. I unzipped it and pulled out the one suit I owned, charcoal wool, single-breasted, the suit I'd worn exactly once, to Lorraine's funeral. I laid it across the bed. The fabric was rough under my fingers. The cedar smell of the closet clung to it, mixing with something older, something that smelled like goodbye. Tuesday morning, when Harlan Prescott walked through my door expecting a confused old man, he'd find me in this suit, standing, ready, and not alone. I turned off the light and sat in the dark for the second night in a row. But this time, the dark felt different. It didn't feel like waiting. It felt like aim. The charcoal suit hung on the closet door all night like an outline of the man I was about to become. By morning, I'd made peace with it, not with what was coming, but with the fact that I couldn't stop it now even if I wanted to. The aim was set. All that remained was Tuesday. Faye's office smelled like copier ink and cold coffee, and the man behind her desk had already read every page before I walked through the door. Boyd Stanton, 48, was the Nye County Deputy DA crew cut, quiet voice, a conviction rate that spoke louder than he did. He sat with 7 labeled folders spread in front of him like a hand of cards he'd already decided to play. Break forensics, the death certificate, the POA clause, Prescott's paralegal connection, Dexter Finch's sworn statement, the burner phone records, the fake appraisal bait. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered in 25 days, flattened into paper and filed in order. 7 folders on a desk. That's what 25 days of grief, rage, and detective work look like when you compress them down to something a courtroom can hold. Boyd asked questions precisely quiet, each one landing like a scalpel. He went through the break line evidence twice, the POA clause 3 times, and Dexter's statement word by word. "Walk me through the break line one more time," he said. "Who identified the cutting tool?" Fay answered. Hewitt's forensic tech matched it to the same class of industrial tube cutter, same model found in the Ridgeline Basin storage unit. Boyd closed the last folder. He looked at me with eyes that had seen 1,000 cases and didn't waste time pretending this one was anything but ugly. "This is enough for a conspiracy charge," he said. "If Prescott walks into that signing and presents the documents, the act itself constitutes attempted fraud on top of everything else. He crosses your threshold with those papers, and the charge writes itself." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding for 25 days. Then Hewitt unfolded his floor plan. He'd drawn it by hand. My ranch, my kitchen, my hallways marked with X's and arrows like a battlefield map for a war being fought in a house where I used to eat breakfast with my wife. He circled 3 entry points. 1 officer in the mudroom behind the coat rack, 1 in the barn loft with a sight line to the kitchen door, a 3rd in an unmarked vehicle on the ranch road. You ever rehearse the worst day of your life with strangers who call it an operation, as if your family is a surgery they need to cut open cleanly? That's what the next 2 hours felt like. Hewitt walked me through every step, where to sit, what to say, how long to hold the performance. "You let them sit down," Hewitt said, his pen tapping the kitchen table on the diagram. "You let Prescott open his briefcase. You let Vivienne place the pen in your hand. You do not pick it up. You say the words, 'Show me exactly where to sign.' That's my go signal. That's when I come through the kitchen door." I nodded. My mouth tasted like metal. The coffee Fay had poured sat untouched, cold and bitter. "And if Garrett's there?" I asked. The room went quiet. Hewitt looked at Boyd. Boyd looked at me. The silence lasted long enough for me to understand that nobody in this room had a clean answer for that question. "If your son is present," Boyd said carefully, "he will be detained along with everyone else until we can determine his level of involvement. We won't know his status until we're in the room. He's my son." "I understand that, Mr. Caldwell." Boyd met my eyes. "And I understand that you've spent 25 days building a case that most people wouldn't have survived long enough to finish. But on Tuesday, you have to be the man who sits at that table and performs. Not a father, not a victim. The man who holds the line." He paused. "You have to perform until the very last moment." I looked at the floor plan. My kitchen table drawn in pencil, with arrows pointing to doors I'd walked through 10,000 times. It didn't look like my home anymore. It looked like evidence. Boyd stood. He buttoned his jacket, picked up his briefcase, and extended his hand. "Tuesday morning," he said, 8 a.m. sharp. "We'll already be inside your house before they arrive." I shook his hand. His grip was firm, steady. Certain the steadiest thing I'd felt in 25 days. Steadier than my own. I held it for a second longer than I needed to, because letting go meant the next time I touched anything, it would be the handle of my own front door on the morning everything changed. I let go of Boyd's hand and drove home in the dark. The road between Tonopah and the ranch had never felt so short, as if the desert itself was hurrying me towards something it knew was coming. I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off and waited for the morning the way you wait for a verdict. The first officer arrived at 5:47 a.m., before the desert light had cleared the Toyabe ridgeline. I watched from the kitchen window as Hewitt pointed the man toward the barn without a word. The officer moved across the yard like a shadow boots on gravel, making no more sound than a cat crossing a room, and disappeared into the loft. A minute later, a second man slipped through the mudroom door and settled behind the coat rack where Lorraine's old rain jacket still hung on its hook. A third drove an unmarked SUV around the back of the equipment shed and cut the engine. Hewitt came inside last. He moved through my kitchen the way he'd moved through Faye's office, measured, deliberate, touching nothing he didn't need to touch. He knelt under the table and taped a small transmitter to the underside of the wood. I felt the adhesive edge brush my knee when I sat down. "When Prescott opens his briefcase," Hewitt said, standing, "I need you to say the words exactly. Show me exactly where to sign. That's my go signal. And if he doesn't bring a briefcase, he will. Men like Prescott always bring the props." 3 armed men hiding in a 67-year-old man's house at dawn, and the most dangerous person in the building was the one sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee cup. That thought should have felt absurd. It didn't. It felt like the truest thing I'd known in weeks. Hewitt checked the radio channels one more time, tested the sightline from the barn loft to the kitchen door, and then nodded at me the way one man nods at another when there's nothing left to say. He stepped into the hallway and went quiet. The house settled around his silence like water closing over a stone. I was alone. Not really. 3 men were breathing within 50 feet of me, but in every way that mattered. I was alone at my kitchen table, the way I'd been alone for 14 months. The difference was that today, the loneliness was tactical. I set the stage. 2 coffee cups, mine and one for the guest I was pretending to welcome. The sugar bowl Lorraine always kept filled. The white ceramic one with the chipped rim she refused to replace because her mother had given it to her. A pen, laid beside a blank notepad. Props. Every item a lie told in porcelain and metal. Lorraine would have hated every second of this, the deception, the officers, the theater of it all. But she would have set the sugar bowl out too, because that's what you do when people come to your house. Even when the people are coming to rob you. I brewed coffee in her old percolator, not the drip machine I used on regular mornings, but the one she insisted made better coffee. The one that filled the kitchen with a smell so familiar it hurt. I poured a cup and drank it too hot, burning my tongue. The pain felt like focus. Then I sat at the table and looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. The glass gave back a man in a charcoal suit, Lorraine's funeral suit with oil-stained knuckles that no amount of scrubbing would ever make clean, and a face that had spent 67 years being underestimated by everyone who looked at it. I practiced the expression, the confused blink, the grateful nod, the slight tremble in the hands that I'd been perfecting for 25 days. I watched my reflection become the man Vivian expected to find diminished, bewildered, ready to sign anything someone put in front of him. I held the expression until it stopped feeling like a lie. And then I realized something that sat in my chest like a key turning in a lock. This disguise worked because it wasn't entirely a disguise. I had been this man, quiet, small, stepping aside for most of my life. The only difference was that today I knew what it was for. "You're just an old man signing papers you don't understand," I whispered to the glass. "That's all they need to see." I turned off the kitchen light. I sat in the dark with my hands around the warm cup. The transmitter hummed faintly beneath the table. The officers were silent. The pen lay untouched. Outside. The first pale edge of Tuesday's sun crept over the basin. Somewhere on the highway, a car was already heading toward the ranch. I took one more sip of coffee. I set the cup down, and I waited. The car on the highway wasn't coming for me. It passed the ranch road without slowing, taillights shrinking into the basin like 2 red embers dying. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Vivian's voice was honeyed and apologetic. "The broker has a conflict tomorrow. We'll need to push to Wednesday." I told her Wednesday was fine. I set the phone down next to the pen I'd laid out like a prop and stared at the transmitter's faint green light beneath the wood. The sting was supposed to happen today. Every officer was in position, every wire live, every lie rehearsed. And now I had one more night I hadn't planned for and didn't want. Hewitt extracted his men by noon. They'd return before dawn Wednesday. The house emptied the way a theater empties after a canceled show, one shadow at a time, until the only person left was the one who'd been pretending. I spent the afternoon doing nothing. I stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the 2 coffee cups still set on the table and thought about putting them away, but didn't. Everything could wait. Everything except the thing I'd been refusing to do for 25 days. At sunset, I walked to the ridge. It's the highest point on the property, a shelf of red rock where Lorraine and I used to sit after supper with our boots hanging over the edge. She said it was the only place in Nevada where you could see the earth breathing. I thought she was being poetic until the geological survey came back and she laughed so hard she spilled her coffee. "Our dirt might be worth something," she said. Imagine that. I sat on the same flat stone, still warm from the day's sun. The basin turned gold, then violet, then the color of a bruise healing from the inside. I gave myself 1 hour. How do you grieve for a son who's still alive, who might be standing in your kitchen tomorrow in handcuffs? You don't grieve the man, you grieve the boy. The 12-year-old who followed me through the barn asking about every tool on the wall. The teenager who drove the truck too fast and laughed when I yelled. The young man who stood at his mother's graveside and held my arm so tight I felt his pulse through his jacket. That boy didn't marry a woman who'd sabotaged his father's truck. That boy was gone. And the man who replaced him might have known what Vivian was doing, or might have been too afraid to stop it. Or might have been something in between I'd never fully understand. You always said I was too stubborn to know when I was beaten. I said to the stone, to the wind. You were right about that. You were wrong that it was a flaw. A coyote called once from the basin floor. The sound rose and fell and didn't repeat. He was a good boy once. I have to remember that tomorrow, or I won't be able to look at him. The tears came. I let them dry in the wind, the way the desert dries everything patiently, without judgment. The salt sat on my lips like a taste I'd been holding for weeks. When the hour was up, I stood, brushed the red dust from my trousers. The stone was cool now. I walked back toward the house in the last light. The ranch looked the same as it had for 40 years. Same fence posts, same porch light, same dust. But it was a theater set now. And every familiar thing was a lie told in the right direction. I passed the barn where the officer had crouched that morning. The equipment shed where the SUV had idled. The mudroom door the second man had slipped through before dawn. My home was a trap, and I was the bait that chose to be bait. I stopped at Garrett's childhood bedroom window. The room was dark. The bed still made from the last time he'd slept here, years ago, when he was still the person I thought he was. I pressed my palm against the cold glass. Tomorrow, you'll know who your father really is, I whispered. The sting wasn't just about justice. It wasn't about the land or the money or the woman who'd tried to take both. It was about the mask, the confused old rancher, the helpless father, the man who didn't understand what he owned. Tomorrow I'd take that mask off, and my son would see the face underneath for the first time. I pulled my hand from the glass and walked inside. I didn't turn on any lights. I sat in the kitchen chair and waited for morning, the way a man waits for a verdict, still, silent. And certain that whatever comes next, I earned the right to face it. Morning came the way a held breath finally releases slow, inevitable, and sharper than I expected. I stood at the kitchen window in Lorraine's funeral suit and watched the first light clear the ridgeline. The charcoal wool smelled like cedar from the closet. The coffee was brewing. The transmitter hummed beneath the table. Hewitt's men had returned before dawn, silent as the first time. 3 cars came up the ranch road at 9:58. 2 minutes early. Vivian stepped out of the first one, smoothing her jacket like she was arriving at a closing which, in her mind, she was. Harlan Prescott climbed out of the second, leather briefcase in hand, cologne reaching the porch before he did. And from the third car, hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground, came my son. I opened the door and let the mask settle over my face one final time. Come in, I said, stepping aside. Coffee's on. I made it strong, figured we'd need it for all this paperwork. Vivian smiled. Prescott nodded. Garrett wouldn't look at me. I played the part the way I'd rehearsed it in the dark window. I fumbled with the sugar bowl. I squinted at the documents Prescott fanned across the table as though the print were too small for my old eyes. I asked him to explain the transfer language twice, and when he used the phrase mineral extraction rights, I tilted my head and said, "Now, that just means the dirt." Right. Prescott's smile was patient and practiced. Essentially, yes, Mr. Caldwell. This transfers the subsurface rights to Ridgeline Basin LLC, standard language. It's just a formality, Eugene, Vivian added. We talked about this. You want to know what 25 days of pretending to be a fool sounds like? 6 words. I reached for the pen Vivian had placed beside the papers. I held it over the signature line. And I looked up at Prescott with the same bewildered gratitude I'd been wearing since the day I drove my sabotaged truck into a ditch. Show me exactly where to sign. The mudroom door opened. Hewitt stepped through, badge on his belt, hand resting on his hip. Behind me, the kitchen door swung wide, and the barn officer filled the frame. From the hallway, Boyd Stanton emerged, crew-cut, quiet voice, the same steady presence that had shaken my hand 3 days ago. Faye Langley rose from behind the living room partition, where she'd been sitting since before the cars arrived. I set the pen down. I straightened my spine, and I let the mask fall. The confused old rancher was gone. The bewildered father-in-law was gone. The man who didn't understand what lithium was worth gone. What was left was a 67-year-old man in his dead wife's funeral suit who had spent 25 days building a trap out of patience and grief. I looked directly at Vivian. You tried to kill me for land I would have shared, I said. My voice didn't tremble. Lorraine left me $36 million in lithium rights, and all you had to do was ask. $36 million. That's what my wife's land was worth. And that's what my daughter-in-law decided my life was worth less than. Vivian's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The brake line on my truck was cut with the same kind of industrial tube cutter. I continued. The same tool used on Clyde Barker's truck 2 years ago, 12 miles from this ranch. Your paralegal license. Prescott's pre-wedding contact with you. The burner phone. Dexter Finch's testimony connecting every piece. I laid each fact on the table the way Prescott had laid his papers, neat, sequential, undeniable. Boyd stepped forward. Harlan Prescott, Vivian Ashford, you are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and elder exploitation. Prescott's face went gray. He spun toward the kitchen door. The barn officer stood with arms crossed. He turned to the mudroom. Hewitt blocked it. He turned to the hallway. Boyd. Every exit was a badge. His briefcase sat open on the table, the unsigned papers catching the morning light like a confession that wrote itself. Vivian found her voice. She turned not to me, not to Boyd, not to Hewitt, but to Garrett. Tell them, she said. Garrett, tell them this is a mistake. My son stood at the edge of the kitchen. He hadn't moved since the doors opened. His hands were still in his pockets. His face held something I couldn't read. Not shock, not guilt, not relief. Something between all three that hadn't settled into any one thing yet. He said nothing. The silence lasted 3 seconds. It felt like the rest of my life. 3 seconds of silence, and then Vivian broke it. Not with words, with a sound I'd never heard from her, a scream that started as outrage and ended as something feral. Cornered. Stripped of every polished syllable she'd ever used in my kitchen. "This is insane," she gasped, turning from Boyd to Hewitt to me. "I never told anyone to touch those brakes. Harlan did that on his own. I had nothing to do with it." Prescott's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. A man who builds shell companies for a living knows when to stop talking. Boyd looked at Hewitt. Hewitt nodded once. Then Boyd turned toward the kitchen door and said, "Send him in." The door opened one last time, and Dexter Finch stepped through. He was pale. His hands were steady. He wore the same flannel jacket he'd worn at the diner, and he didn't look at me or Boyd or Hewitt. He looked directly at Vivian. "March 14th, Dexter said. His voice was flat, rehearsed, certain. "Your office at Ridgeline Basin, 3:15 in the afternoon. You told Prescott, make sure the old man doesn't survive the drive home from Tonopah. I was standing in the hallway. You didn't close the door." The room stopped. She didn't close the door. That's it. That's the whole reason she's going to prison. A door left open 3 inches on a Tuesday afternoon in March. All the planning, all the shell companies, all the forged documents and cut brake lines and paralegal licenses buried under new names. And it came down to a door she forgot to shut while ordering a man's death. Vivian's scream died in her throat. What replaced it was worse. A whisper. Aimed not at Boyd or Dexter, but at the one person in the room she still believed she could reach. "You're lying," she said, staring at Garrett. "He's lying. Garrett, tell them." My son hadn't moved. He stood at the edge of the kitchen, where he'd been standing since the officers appeared, hands still in his pockets, face locked in that expression I couldn't read. Every person in the room turned to him. Vivian reached across the space between them and gripped his forearm. "Garrett, please," she said. "Don't let them do this. I did it for us." I did it for us. 4 words. She said them the way someone says, "I love you," with absolute conviction, without a flicker of doubt. She genuinely believed that conspiring to murder her father-in-law was an act of devotion. That's not villainy. That's something colder. That's a person who rearranged the definition of love until it included killing. Garrett looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at me. And then he pulled free her fingers, sliding off his sleeve like water off a stone, and took 2 steps toward me. 2 steps. That's how far a son has to walk to choose his father over his wife. I will remember every inch of those 2 steps for the rest of my life. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Hewitt moved. The handcuffs clicked around Vivian's wrists with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The barn officer cuffed Prescott, who went quietly, his face the color of old cement. Boyd read the formal charges in that steady voice of his: conspiracy, attempted murder, fraud, elder exploitation, and each word landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Vivian screamed Garrett's name once more as Hewitt guided her through the mudroom door. Garrett flinched, but didn't turn around. Hewitt paused at the threshold and looked at my son. "You're not under arrest," he said, "but I'll need you at the station by end of day for a full statement." Garrett nodded. He still hadn't spoken. I walked to the sink and spat out the mouthful of cold coffee I'd been holding since the doors opened. It tasted like metal and the end of something. We stood on the porch and watched them leave. 3 patrol cars, dust rising behind each one like smoke signals nobody was sending. The convoy turned off the ranch road and disappeared behind the Basin Ridge. And the sound faded until there was nothing left but wind and the faint hum of the transmitter still running under the kitchen table. 3 feet of porch boards separated us. Behind us, the kitchen held the evidence of everything: coffee cups, unsigned papers, a pen I never used, a sugar bowl with a chipped rim that Lorraine would have filled regardless. Garrett opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the ground. My hands were shaking, for the first time all morning. My hands were shaking, and I let them. Garrett finally spoke that morning on the porch, one sentence, barely above a whisper. I didn't know about the brakes. Then he walked to his car and drove to the station to give his statement. I watched until the dust settled behind him and went inside to wash the coffee cups. 2 weeks later, Boyd called with a number I wasn't expecting. Not a dollar amount, not a sentence length, a body count. Prescott's talking, Boyd said. He was sitting at my kitchen table again, case files spread across the same wood where the unsigned transfer papers had been. Faye sat beside him, reading along. 4 other cases, same playbook, staged brake failures, forged powers of attorney, shell companies feeding into Ridgeline Basin. Clyde Barker was the 2nd. You were supposed to be the 5th. I stared at the county map Boyd had unfolded. 4 ranches circled in red ink, names I didn't recognize, people I'd never met, lives I might have saved if I'd figured things out sooner. Barker's death has been officially reclassified, Boyd continued. Homicide. Prescott's cooperating, gave us dates, methods, the full chain. He's trying to take the death penalty off the table. And Vivian, Faye asked, lawyered up, hasn't said a word since the arrest. Her attorney filed a motion to suppress Finch's testimony it won't hold, but she'll fight every inch of this. And Dexter? I asked. Immunity on the scouting charge, Boyd said. Cost of putting Prescott's network on record. He earned it. 5 old people on 5 pieces of land worth more than anyone told them. One man in a nice suit deciding which ones needed to die first. I sat with that for a long time after Boyd and Faye left. I sat with the fact that I was number 5 on a list, and the only reason I was sitting in my kitchen instead of buried in my dirt was because Murray Dalton noticed a cut that was too clean to be corrosion. The next morning, I drove to Opal Barker's ranch. I'd never been inside her house. I'd spoken to her once, briefly, when Hewitt first mentioned Clyde's name during the investigation. But I owed her more than a phone call. I owed her the truth delivered the way it should have been delivered 2 years ago, face to face, at a kitchen table, from someone who believed her. Her kitchen looked like mine. Same Formica countertop, same coffee stains in the same places, same chair across the table where a spouse used to sit. The chair was pushed in tight against the table edge, the way you push a chair in when no one's coming back to use it. I understood then that I was looking at the life I almost had alone, with a death no one believed was murder. Opal poured coffee without asking if I wanted any. It was stronger than Lorraine's, brewed by a woman who had stopped caring about bitterness a long time ago. They killed Clyde the same way they tried to kill me, I said. The brakes. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. Opal set her cup down. She was 74. With hands that had worked cattle wire and tax forms in equal measure. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. I knew it wasn't an accident, she said. I told the sheriff. I told the insurance adjuster. I told our pastor and our neighbor and the man at the feed store who knew Clyde 40 years. Nobody listened. Her voice was steady. No tremor, no bitterness. Just the flat exhaustion of a woman who had screamed into silence until her throat gave out. The case has been reclassified, I told her. Homicide. The man who did it is cooperating. He'll testify against the woman who ordered it. Will she go to prison? If there's any justice left in this county, yes. Opal reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was small and dry and fierce, the grip of someone holding on to the only proof that she hadn't been crazy for 2 years. Thank you for not stopping, she said. I held her hand until she let go. I finished the coffee. I drove home through the basin with the windows down and the dust coating meat. And I thought about all the kitchen tables in Nevada where old people sat alone with truths nobody believed. Halfway home. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a text from Garrett, the first contact since the morning of the arrests. 3 words. Can we talk? I pulled to the shoulder. The engine idled. The desert light hit the screen until the words faded to shadows. But I'd already read them. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, not turning it in either direction. I texted back one word, yes, and drove home. I didn't call, I didn't add conditions. Some conversations need the weight of showing up, and this one had been traveling toward us for 25 days. Garrett's silver truck appeared at the ranch gate on a Thursday afternoon. I'd rehearsed 100 versions of what I'd say when he came back, but every one of them dissolved the moment I saw him standing on the far side of the gate, shoulders lower than I remembered, hands hanging at his sides like he'd forgotten what to do with them. He didn't open the gate, he didn't assume the right. I walked down from the porch and stopped on my side. The chain clinked between us in the wind. The afternoon sun had warmed the metal tube to the point where resting my hand on it felt like touching something alive. "I need to tell you something," Garrett said. "All of it. No pieces." I nodded. He told me he'd suspected Vivian months before the wedding. Small things, conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Documents she locked in a desk he didn't have a key to. A meeting with Prescott she claimed was about estate planning, but couldn't explain when he asked twice. He convinced himself he was paranoid. He married her anyway. After the brake failure, the suspicion turned to certainty. He found references to Ridgeline Basin on her laptop. He recognized Prescott's name. He understood what the mineral rights were worth and what someone might do to control them. "I called that number because I thought if I recorded him I could bring it to you," Garrett said. His voice cracked on the word "you." But I heard his voice and I froze. I hung up. I told myself I'd try again. I never did. What do you do with a son who was too afraid to save you, but too decent to help kill you? There's no word for that space between guilty and innocent. I've been standing in it with him for a month. "You knew what she was," I said, "and you married her anyway." "I know." He looked at the ground. "I don't have an answer for that. I don't think I ever will." The gate stood between us. A simple thing. Metal tube, 2 hinges, a latch that rusts every winter. But that afternoon, it was the most important piece of architecture on the property because it was the exact distance between what I felt and what I could say. I could have opened it. Part of me wanted to. The father in me wanted to pull my son through that gate and hold him the way I held him when he was 9 and afraid of the dark. But I wasn't that father right now. And he wasn't that boy. And opening the gate before I was ready would be a kindness that tasted like a lie. "I'm not going to say I forgive you," I said. "Not today. Because if I said it right now, it would be for me, not for you. And you deserve the real thing or nothing." Garrett's chin dropped. He breathed in through his nose, slow and ragged. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know, but I didn't say never. That has to be enough for now." He stood there another moment. The wind carried the faint scent of his aftershave across the gate, the same brand I used to buy him for Christmas, years ago, when presents were simple and sons were knowable. Then he nodded. He didn't argue, he didn't beg. He walked back to the truck, started the engine, quieter this time, no rush, and pulled onto the ranch road. I watched the dust trail until it dissolved over the ridge. My hand was still on the gate latch. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't locked it either. The tears came then, and I let them sit on my face the way the desert lets everything sit without commentary, without hurry. The dust from his tires settled on my lips, and I tasted it and didn't wipe it away. I turned and walked back toward the house, past the barn where the officer had crouched, past the mudroom door, past the kitchen window where I'd watched 3 cars arrive on a Wednesday morning that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Inside the house was quiet. Not the grief quiet of the months after Lorraine died. Not the tactical quiet of the morning before the sting. A new kind of quiet. The kind that comes after the last question has been asked, and the answer is still somewhere on the road, traveling toward you at its own pace. The answer arrived in pieces, the way most real answers do. Not all at once, not with trumpets, but in courtrooms and kitchens, and one Thursday afternoon on a porch with 2 cups of coffee. Vivian's team fought every motion they could, but the evidence pile Boyd had built left no room to maneuver, and the case moved faster than anyone expected. The sentencing was in May. I sat in the gallery under fluorescent lights that made everyone look 10 years older, and watched the judge read the numbers. Vivian received 22 years. Her attorney's pen stopped moving when the number landed, and that told me everything I needed to know about how long 22 years really was. Vivian herself didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead with the same composed expression she'd worn in my kitchen, as if the courtroom were just another room she intended to manage. Prescott received 18, his cooperation buying him 4 years of mercy. He looked at the floor when the gavel came down, one sharp crack that ended 2 lives and started something else. I felt no triumph. I felt the flat, gray finality of a door closing on a room I never wanted to enter. 22 years. That's how long it takes a courtroom to say what I learned in 25 days. That some people look at your life and see a price tag. And the only defense is refusing to be as small as they assumed you were. 2 weeks later, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table, same chairs, same chipped sugar bowl, and signed the papers Faye had prepared. The Lorraine Caldwell Land Trust, a fund using a portion of the lithium royalties to provide legal defense for elderly landowners targeted by mineral rights fraud across Nevada. I signed with the same pen Vivian had placed beside the transfer documents, the one I'd never used for its intended purpose. The trust is active, Faye said, collecting the pages. First case referral came in yesterday, a 74-year-old widow in Esmeralda County. Same playbook, different shell company. Then it's already worth it. I looked at the kitchen table and the scratches, the coffee rings, the faint outline where the transmitter's adhesive had pulled at the finish. Lorraine would have said I was being dramatic. She would have also said it was about time. The land that nearly killed me was now protecting people I'd never meet. That felt like the closest thing to justice I was going to get. Not punishment, not revenge, but a shield built from the same dirt someone tried to steal. Garrett came back on a Thursday. This time, he opened the gate himself. I watched from the porch as he walked up the path, no hesitation in his step, no hands in his pockets, no eyes on the ground. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was done being afraid of it. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "I quit Lodestar," he said. "Move back to Tonopah. I want to work the ranch, no salary, no timeline, just work, if you'll let me." I looked at my son. He was 34 years old, and he looked every day of it. The boy who'd followed me through the barn asking about tools was gone. The man standing in front of me was someone new, not the person I'd raised, not the person Vivian had shaped, but someone in between who was trying to figure out which parts to keep. Making 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, that's the whole story, really, if you strip away the lawyers and the detectives and the handcuffs. A man deciding that the person standing in front of him is still worth the trouble of a second cup. I didn't answer him. I walked inside, brewed the percolator, poured 2 mugs black for me, 2 sugars for him, the way he'd taken it since he was 16 and thought coffee made him groan. I carried them to the porch and handed him one. Our fingers brushed on the ceramic. It was the first time we'd touched since before the arrests. "It's not forgiveness," I said. "Not yet. But is coffee." Garrett took the mug. He sat down in the chair beside mine, Lorraine's chair, the one no one had used in nearly 16 months. I let him. We sat on that porch until the sun dropped behind the Toyabe Range and the coffee went cold in our hands. Neither of us spoke. The land stretched out in front of us, Lorraine's land, now protected by her name, guarded by the man she married and the son who was learning, slowly, what that kind of love costs. It wasn't a happy ending. It was a beginning. And for 2 quiet men on a porch in Nevada, that was enough. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 25 days pretending to be less than I was, playing the fool so the people who wanted to destroy me would feel safe enough to show their hand. Looking back, my biggest mistake wasn't trusting my daughter-in-law. It was waiting so long to trust myself. Don't make that mistake. If something feels wrong in your gut, listen to it before someone else decides your silence is permission. This wasn't a revenge story in the way most people think of one. There were no explosions, no dramatic speeches in front of a crowd. My revenge was patience. It was sitting at a kitchen table with a pen I never intended to use and letting the truth do the work I couldn't do with anger. If there's a lesson in this revenge story, it's that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous. Not because they're planning harm, but because they're paying attention. I believe God put me through this for a reason. Not to punish me, but to show me that the strength I needed was already there in stubbornness, in love, in the refusal to let someone else write the ending of my life. And if you take one thing from this revenge story, let it be this. You are never too old to fight for what's yours. And you are never too broken to protect the people who still need you. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in my place. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time means more to me than you know. As always, some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. The message is what matters, and I hope it stays with you.